There are patterns woven into the fabric of history, rhythms that do not merely repeat, but unfold according to a providential design. To discern them requires more than casual observation. It demands a theological imagination, an ability to see history itself as a theater where divine judgment and human striving meet. It is with this in mind that I return to an old lecture, one that might prove useful in tracking the upheavals of the past few years and in anticipating what is to come, particularly within the video game industry, a small but revealing battleground in the broader culture war. What is happening there is not unique. It is merely a visible instance of a phenomenon that affects every institution under heaven. In recent days, I have been reminded of the work of Pastor Rich Bledsoe, who observed that meaningful change within institutions tends to occur after a span of 7 years, a week of years, echoing an ancient biblical pattern.
If you want to study the business gurus, what they will tell you is that to really bring meaningful change to any institution takes between 7 and 10 years. 7 years, of course, is significant. That's one time period. It's a week, or a week of years in the Bible. The whole biblical calendar is built on sevens. What's happened nationwide is that about every 4 to 5 years, university presidents or provosts or chancellors, they just stand up and they play musical chairs and they just change places because they all know that they cannot survive for more than 4 or 5 years. Very deep knowledge they all have. It takes between 7 and 10 years to make meaningful change in an institution. You've got 7. What's half of 7? 3.5, which is how many months, by the way? 42. And 42 months is, of course, a biblical, you hear this all the time from the time of, who's the first 42 months? Where's this come from, Jim? Elijah, praying for drought. And there's drought for 42 months, which is half of 7. I would posit that Jesus was probably crucified at 42 months or 3.5 years. We always say it's 3 years. I suspect it was 3.5. I suspect it was 42 months. And the meaning, of course, is exactly, it means 7 cut in 2. It's a curse. In other words, the time that's taken for full development, for full maturation, you're cut off in the middle.
His insight is not solitary. Many business theorists, surveying the debris fields of failed ventures and exhausted movements, have come to similar conclusions. Yet Bledsoe, unlike the secular analysts, understands that this pattern is not arbitrary. It is theological. It is woven into the nature of time itself, and it offers a reason why man must think theologically rather than merely philosophically. Around 2020, we saw the coordinated infiltration of the media and entertainment industries by progressive ideological actors. But now, after 42 months, half a week full of years, the fruits of that infiltration have begun to rot in public view. Sweet Baby Inc., for example, has been unmasked, along with many other imposters who traded in hollow virtue. And this phenomenon is not confined to corporations. It is visible even within the stranger corners of internet culture, the so-called lolcow space. Figures such as Destiny, Keemstar, iDubbbz, H3, Carl Jobst, and others now find themselves caught in the tremors of an organic shift. Some will be sifted out like wheat and discarded. Others will adapt, though not without cost. And none of this is new. This cycle is as old as the fall of man. Those who pay attention, who watch the times and seasons, will recognize the signs. They will see that collapse is never arbitrary. It is judgment, and judgment is always purposeful. According to Bledsoe, the 42-month mark is not a blessing, it is a curse, a halfway point, a sign of incomplete testing. For true maturation demands the fullness of 7 years. Only then is the worth of a person, a business, or an institution revealed in the crucible of time. And thus we turn to the theme at hand, the nature of the lolcow. What makes a man or woman a fitting scapegoat for the mob? I believe I have found an answer that suffices. It is not the mere eccentricity or simple failure of a man. It is the mystery of the scapegoat mechanism itself, the ancient human impulse to purge communal guilt by sacrificing a chosen victim. To see this clearly is to understand that even in mockery, even in the sordid corners of internet drama, profound spiritual realities are being played out.
Let's talk about liars. Americans are fascinated by them. When someone is content to lie all the time about everything, we make a movie about them. Some of them are even based on books written by the liars themselves, which then turn out to be full of lies. We do this for the same reason we make TV shows about comically fat people. We're fascinated by people who give in to every single temptation. It's partly that sense of superiority we get, and partly wish fulfillment. But it's also because living like that is so out of the ordinary. If everyone weighed 600 pounds, no one would be making TV shows about people who weigh 600 pounds. People could just look down.
What Wade gestures toward is nothing less than the reactivation of the oldest and most persistent human mechanism, the sacrificial system described by René Girard. Beneath the surface of the internet's theater of mockery lies the same ancient structure of violence, the mechanism by which communities gripped by mimetic contagion avert self-destruction through the expulsion of a surrogate victim. Through platforms like the Kiwi Farms and similar digital forums, the phenomenon of the lolcow has been not merely observed, but institutionalized. Regardless of whether figures like Chris Chan or Ethan Ralph or Nick Rekieta ever desired such attentions, they have been cast into a role that is no longer optional. They have been rendered into icons of public derision, scapegoats upon whose perceived failures an anxious and collapsing culture projects its own guilt, shame, and frustration. And in this sense, the lolcow is not merely a figure of mockery. He is an involuntary participant in a spiritual drama. He bears the sin of the multitude even as the multitude feasts upon his humiliation. He is the broken image of the sacrificial victim. But unlike Christ, who bore our sins willingly and redemptively, these modern scapegoats suffer without purpose, without honor, and without hope of resurrection. Thus, to mock them without understanding is to partake unknowingly in the spirit of an age that devours its own children. And now we are to consider Synthetic Man, and the question of whether the title of lolcow may rightly be ascribed to him. Like many who have risen to public notice, his path was one of humble beginnings. And though I was not present to witness the earliest stages of his emergence on YouTube, it is plain to any discerning eye that Synthetic Man once bore a demeanor less tempered by strife, less marked by the scars of public engagement, than the person who streams Dragon Ball The Breakers over and over. It remains an open question whether the hardness that now characterizes him is the product of the weight of fame, a natural consequence of long exposure to the corrosive elements of public life, or whether it is the revelation of that which was always latent within him, brought forth under various pressures. Yet this much is beyond dispute. Synthetic Man has passed through the crucible of his 3.5-year trial, that ancient pattern of testing, and he has emerged not shattered by the curse, but tempered by it. A man who by endurance has borne witness to the mysterious work of maturation that suffering alone can accomplish.
And I said, what will happen is, you're here, you've been called in as the person who's going to solve all the problems of the institution. The first year will be a marvelous honeymoon. Everyone will love you. The second year it will get tougher. Somewhere between the third and the fourth year, all hell will break loose and they will try to crucify you. As you approach 3.5, if there isn't a crisis that they can pin on you, they will invent one.
And now Synthetic Man's channel is nearly 5 years old, and the passage of time carries with it no small significance. The 42-month trial, that period so often marking the threshold between emergence and judgment, has been crossed at some point in time. Perhaps if one counts backward from the publication of Dead Domain's attempted hit piece, it becomes clear that nearly 4 years have elapsed, suggesting that the internal drama which unfolded was not incidental, but it was inevitable, an organic outworking of patterns that govern human enterprises, however small their stage. It was perhaps necessary that Synthetic Men endure a crucifixion of sorts, not by the hand of any one individual, but as part of a larger providential rhythm that demands the testing of anyone who rises to prominence. Such ordeals are not accidents, they are written into the very fabric of maturation itself. With greater visibility came inevitable trials. phases of torment that Pastor Bledsoe so carefully describes. These afflictions, once the purview of physical institutions, now visit themselves upon the digital commons with no less ferocity. Synthetic Man was not spared. His path forward became a gauntlet of increasing opposition, malign attacks from EFAP eventually culminating in Dead Domain's attempted hit piece, strikes against his channel, and then a quiet blacklisting that rendered his very name unmentionable in many corners of YouTube, as though he were Voldemort in Rowling's Harry Potter series. And yet remarkably, Synthetic Man endured. More than endured, he survived that 42-month curse. He emerged not unscathed, but stronger, tempered by the fires of trial as iron is made into steel. And indeed, if there is any single moment that crystallized Synthetic Man's survival, it is found in what many regard as his lowest point, the infamous Immortals of Avium stream. And there I need not repeat the specifics of what he said. The words themselves have been rehearsed often enough by critics and partisans alike. Yet there is a deeper truth here, one that most overlook and fewer repeat.
It's over. It's over. You guys gotta stop jerking off to porn. I'm a living example. My head only is filled with disgusting shit. DSP 2017 incident. Can we get an official segment? Oh my god. Oh my god. It's over. I'm never coming back from this one.
But it was not over. Whatever spirit had seized him, a spirit of despair perhaps, or simply the naked eruption of a wounded soul, has not departed, and its shadow continues to follow Synthetic Man even to this day. We must understand the context in which such moments arise, for we live within the most dysfunctional society in human history. A society estranged not merely from virtue, but from the very conditions that make virtue intelligible. Atomized, imprisoned within screens, denied the natural rhythms of embodied community, human beings have been reduced to solitary nodes of consumption and performance. Human relationships, when they persist at all, are rendered stunted, grotesque, and awkward, the brittle remains of what was once the living bone and flesh of society. But what is remarkable about Synthetic Man is not merely that he too suffers from dysfunction, because in that he is no different from the vast multitude. Rather, what sets him apart is the absence of the typical reflex to seek either approval or attention from his audience regarding his failings. He has not sought to enshrine his dysfunction as virtue, nor to elicit pity as a commodity to be exchanged for likes and loyalty. His brokenness is simply a part of who he is, neither to be celebrated nor marketed, but to be endured. And in this, he becomes strangely resilient. It is far harder to ridicule a man who does not market his sins as triumphs. It is far harder to destroy a figure whose weaknesses are neither hidden nor paraded. In a society wherein dysfunction has become nearly universal, wherein even the most intimate appetites are twisted and perverted by isolation and despair, the attempt to weaponize one man's struggle for shameful spectacle becomes less and less effective. Sexual particularities and fetishes, once rare deviations, have become common markers of spiritual and relational impoverishment. In healthier eras, they might have been healed or at least mitigated through the sanctifying pressures of normal relationships. But such relationships are increasingly impossible under the rule of our pagan institutions, which increasingly exalt atomization and perversion, while scorning communion and covenant. Thus, Synthetic Man's survival is not merely a personal triumph, it is a sign, faint but real, that authenticity, however broken, possesses a kind of spiritual armor against the cynicism of the age.
Let's talk about liars. Americans are fascinated by them. We're fascinated by people who give in to every single temptation. It's partly that sense of superiority we get.
And here, Wade's insights into our obsession with liars comes into sharp focus. One of the defining marks of the lolcow is the sin of falsehood. Not merely foolishness, not merely eccentricity, but deceit. The persistent attempt to fabricate a self more admirable, more innocent, and more pitiable than truth would allow. Consider Boogie 2988, who once fashioned himself as a kind of Mr. Rogers for the digital age, a figure of benevolence, of kindness, even as many events within his own life betrayed that claim. Consider Nick Rekieta, whose public persona has shown itself to be little more than an endless performance of falsehood, a shifting edifice built to obscure rather than to reveal. In the end, the difference between those who are devoured and those who endure is not the presence of weakness, but the presence or absence of truth. But why is it that we feel better about ourselves as we endlessly fascinate ourselves with liars? Why does the spectacle of their downfall offer us a fleeting sense of righteousness? Well, that too is a phenomenon that Pastor Bledsoe addresses with piercing clarity. It is the ancient mechanism of scapegoating.
If there isn't a covenant from God, then what you will have in place is an anti-covenant. And that's what we call dysfunction. That's the popular term for it. We've got dysfunctionality. You will have a system where everybody becomes an enemy to everybody else, and finally there's somebody who's a scapegoat who has to pay the price. Well, in America today, see, it used to be we'll find some scapegoat who's down at the bottom. Now, at least if you're in my town, if you're homeless or if you're poor or if you're a drug addict, you're not a scapegoat of anybody. Why, in fact, you will have every benefit given to you. Increasingly, I think this probably is true increasingly in America, the person who's scapegoated is the person at the top. That's why university presidents only last 4 or 5 years.
In our fallen condition, we seek to offload our guilt, our shame, our unconfessed sins to one another, and therefore we fashion an avatar of condemnation, a figure upon whom we can heap our contempt, our fear, and our loathing, so that we might for a moment stand justified in our own eyes. It is the same mechanism that drove the crowds to cry for Barabbas to crucify Christ. That same impulse animates the bloodthirsty joy with which modern man watches the humiliation of the lolcow, the collapse of the public figure, the disintegration of the once proud and haughty. We must see this clearly. The mockery of the liar is not for the most part an act of moral discernment. It is not the righteous exposure of sin for the sake of repentance. It is a desperate pagan ritual, an attempt to cleanse oneself without confession, to be sanctified without sacrifice, and to ascend without the cross of Christ. And because it is not grounded in truth, but in the spirit of accusation, it never satisfies. The hunger for a new victim, a new object of scorn, is endless. It is a cycle that can only end in death for the scapegoat and eventually for the society that depends on scapegoating as its hidden sacrament. It has become almost instinctual in our time to assign some burden of societal responsibility to those who attain fame or even mere popularity. Those who rise, however briefly, are quickly burdened with expectations they neither sought nor were prepared to bear. Many who are eventually branded as lolcows fall victim to this mechanism. It is not merely their faults that condemn them, it is that, fairly or unfairly, the anxieties and crises of a dysfunctional society are pinned to their backs. They become icons of guilt, vessels for communal frustration, sacrifices offered to the ravenous hunger of an age unable to reckon with its own sin. In this, the digital world mirrors and accelerates the ancient scapegoat mechanism Pastor Bledsoe has described. Those who cannot bear the weight of their own corruption must find another to carry it, and if none comes willingly, one will be chosen by force. And in some ways, synthetic man has been made into such a scapegoat. Many within the online sphere continue to treat him as a pariah, a necessary villain for their private dramas, and in many ways he is the perfect candidate for such a role. Our institutions, both secular and virtual, now insist that identity must be defined by dysfunction. One must not only confess one's deviations, one must celebrate them, exalt them, parade them as badges of authenticity. Admit you're gay, admit you're bi, admit that you're trans, and so forth. It's all pure indoctrination, a coercion of the soul dressed up as liberation. Gamers, tragically, have proven among the most susceptible to this new liturgy. Gaming as a cultural force lacks true cohesion. It possesses no shared language, no enduring institutions, and no generational lineage by which wisdom might be transmitted. It is a fractured mass of micro-communities, bound together only by a fading and increasingly hollow word, gamer. And that word, it must be said, no longer means anything enduring. Gamers have become lost sheep, wandering without shepherds, easy prey for the wolves. Yet unwittingly into this vacuum steps a figure like Synthetic Man, whose very existence defies the catechism of dysfunction. He has admitted his proclivities, but unlike the modern confessor, he has not sought approval or validation for them. He does not proclaim his brokenness as a virtue. He treats his flaws with disdain rather than celebration.
Have $5 for that absolutely unhinged rant about Ubermensch Fudas with a completely serious look on your face. Unfathomably based. I'm glad you were entertained. That's me just exploring my psychology while being drunk. Is basically exactly what that was. Because, like, most fetishes are some kind of psychological damage that you have, probably from your childhood, most likely. I would figure that my fascination with Fuda likely comes with my issues with women, most likely. It's definitely gotta be directly connected. I mean, I think more normal people are probably just into, like, femdom or something, but not me. I actually don't like femdom. So it probably just, like, instead of femdom, it just somehow twisted into Fuda for some reason. Who knows why? I don't really have an explanation. Trust me, I'm into worse things. I would never ever admit them, no matter how drunk or high or whatever I am. But I'm telling you, I'm into worse things. You just will never know.
And for that reason, it will become increasingly difficult, perhaps impossible, to permanently brand him as a lolcow. Not because he is less awkward, less strange, or less vulnerable than others, but because he has not lied about who he is. And for those who have built their identities on lies, on pretense, on a carefully curated deceit, such an attitude is intolerable. The very existence of a man who refuses to sanctify his own dysfunction is a living rebuke to their shoddily constructed realities. And now we are left to consider what future awaits. Though Synthetic Man may cast himself as a doomer resigned to decline, I am persuaded otherwise. It seems to me that his work is unlikely to vanish, rather it may yet be strengthened through the very trials intended to undo him. Yet time is a stern master, and the future remains veiled from human sight. Let us then await the next season with vigilance and discernment, prepared to witness whatever course Providence appoints.